The blue light of the screen burned against the sudden, cold darkness of the kitchen. It wasn't just the time of night. It was the kind of darkness that settled in your chest, heavy and absolute. My fingers were numb, hovering over the glass, tracing lines I couldn't see, lines that felt like cracks spreading across my world. Each word on the screen was a pinprick, tiny at first, then a searing, blossoming wound. They were messages. Not his. Not mine. Messages from her.
To him.
And then, the ones that stopped my breath, messages from her, to me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage made of bone and dread. The house was silent, thick with the quiet he always left behind when he worked late. The silence I usually cherished, the quiet space where I could finally breathe, now felt like a vacuum sucking all the air from the room, from my lungs. I couldn't look away from the glow, but I couldn't truly see through the sudden blur of unshed tears. This was it. The end. Not a slow fade, not a gentle slope into separation, but a violent, shattering collision. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. My life, before the jagged edges started to show, felt smooth, predictable, like a well-worn path through a familiar woods. I had my routine, he had his. We lived in a comfortable house, the kind with a porch swing and a garden that always needed more attention than I had time for. We had Sunday dinners, plans for retirement that felt solid, etched in stone. I worked part-time, enough to feel independent but still have space for us. For him. My greatest desire wasn't grand adventure or soaring success. It was simple, stability, warmth, a shared future built on trust and quiet understanding. I loved him, or the man I thought he was. I trusted him implicitly. Our life wasn't a fairy tale, but it was mine, and it felt real, grounded, safe. He was my anchor. Or so I believed. But anchors, I learned, can sometimes be made of sand. The first grain started shifting so subtly, I barely noticed. Late nights at the office became more frequent. Business trips stretched by an extra day, then two. His phone became an extension of his hand, face down on tables, screen guarded like state secrets. When I'd ask, gently at first, about his day, about the long hours, a wall would go up.
A sigh.
A shrug. Then, the words that became a mantra, a weapon. You're being too sensitive. Too sensitive. My concerns were dismissed as anxieties, my intuition pathologized as insecurity. If I mentioned the phone, I was snooping. If I asked about a late night, I was being needy. It's just work, he'd say, his voice flat, sometimes laced with a tired impatience that made me shrink. You worry too much. You need to relax. Stop being so sensitive. I started to believe him. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining things, blowing minor work stress out of proportion. I'd look in the mirror and see a woman who was letting her own fears poison a good thing. I tried harder. I stopped asking questions. I faked indifference to his late arrivals. I focused on the house, on my work, on being less sensitive. I built walls around my worry, plastered a smile over the growing cracks in my peace of mind. I told myself I was strong, independent, not the kind of woman who clung or questioned. I convinced myself his distance was normal, the natural evolution of a long-term relationship, a phase we'd passed through. The quiet unease in my gut? Just me being me. Too sensitive. But the cracks widened despite my efforts to ignore them. His mood swings became erratic. One minute, he'd be charming, almost overly affectionate, as if trying to compensate. The next, he was cold, distant, snapping at trivial things. Our conversations became minefields. Anything I said could trigger an eye roll, a dismissive comment about my overthinking. The intimacy withered, replaced by a polite, hollow routine. He'd touch me sometimes, a perfunctory gesture that felt colder than not being touched at all. My attempts to rekindle things, a special dinner, a planned evening out, were met with excuses, fatigue, or that familiar, weary sigh. I'm tired, he'd say. It's been a long week. Can't you understand that? And always, implicitly or explicitly, the message, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You're too sensitive." I felt like I was drowning, flailing in a sea of unspoken things. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong, but his constant invalidation had chipped away at my confidence, my self-worth. My early struggles were internal, battling my own intuition, wrestling with the narrative he'd imposed on me. Was I paranoid? Was I creating drama where there was none? The gaslighting was insidious, a slow poison eroding my grip on reality. Then came the night that everything escalated. He wasn't just late, he didn't come home at all. No call, no text. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock amplifying the frantic thumping in my chest. I called his office, his mobile, straight to voicemail. Panic, cold and sharp, finally sliced through the fog of self-doubt. This wasn't work, this wasn't stress, this was something else. He finally sauntered in the next morning, smelling faintly of cheap perfume and stale air. His excuse was vague, a garbled story about a client emergency in another town, nowhere near where his office was. When I confronted him, my voice trembling with exhaustion and fear, he exploded. Not with anger, but with a chilling, calculated fury I had never seen before. "Are you serious?" he'd roared, his face contorted. "You're going to accuse me of something based on one night? After everything I do for this family? You are unbelievable. You need help. You are pathologically sensitive." That fight was the breaking point of my attempts to fix us. I retreated. The house became a battleground of silent accusations and cold shoulders. We existed in the same space, but we were galaxies apart. The crisis deepened. My friends noticed. My family worried. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the extent of it, the soul-crushing loneliness of being dismissed, of having my reality constantly questioned by the one person who is supposed to be my partner. I started losing weight. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every time he looked at me, I saw pity, disdain, boredom. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who seemed to take perverse pleasure in making me feel small and crazy. All seemed lost. The stable life I craved felt like a cruel joke. My desire for a simple, loving future had turned into a desperate plea for a return to sanity, to any semblance of the man I married. I was in this dark place, contemplating what little options I had left, selling the house, moving away, starting over alone, broken, when my phone pinged. It wasn't him. It was an unknown number. And then the first message appeared, followed by another, and another. A cascade of text bubbles filling my screen. Screenshots, conversations, photos, a complete, undeniable timeline of his affair. Dates, times, places, pet names, inside jokes, plans. Not just random hookups, but a relationship ongoing, significant. The woman in the photos, the sender of the messages. I recognized her. A colleague of his. Someone I had met briefly at a work function. Someone who had smiled politely and shaken my hand. My world didn't just crumble. It evaporated. The air rushed back into the room, but it was ice cold, searing my lungs. The messages were a brutal, unflinching confirmation of everything I had suspected, everything I had been told was just my sensitivity. But then, among the sickening revelations of his betrayal, I saw the messages from her to me. They weren't apologetic. They weren't confessional. They were delivered. No context, just the raw data dump. It felt deliberate. Why would she do this? There had to be a reason. Was it guilt? Was she finally seeing him for what he was? Or something else? And that's when the true turning point occurred. It wasn't the infidelity itself that was the ultimate catalyst, but the way I found out. Hand-delivered by the Mistress. It was a bizarre, twisted gift wrapped in pain. My first instinct was pure, blinding rage, followed by a crushing wave of humiliation. He had done this, but she had delivered the final blow, leaving me shattered and exposed. But as I reread the messages, a different feeling began to surface, cold and clear, cutting through the fog of hurt. Her messages to me weren't emotional. They were factual. Timestamps, locations. Like evidence. And suddenly, the phrase he had used so many times echoed in my mind, stripped of its power to wound. You're being too sensitive. Too sensitive?
Was I?
Or had my sensitivity been my internal alarm system, screaming at me while he tried to disable it? Had my intuition, dulled by his gaslighting, been trying to guide me through the maze of his lies? The mistress's message dump wasn't just proof, it was a weapon. She might have intended to hurt me, to expose me, or maybe even hurt him by exposing him to me. But in that moment, reading those cold, clinical texts and screenshots from her, something inside me snapped. The hurt was still there, a deep ache that would linger, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a chilling, calculating clarity. He thought I was weak. He thought I was ruled by my emotions, easily manipulated, easily dismissed. He thought my sensitivity was a flaw he could exploit, a shield he could hide behind. He was wrong. My sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was a radar, picking up signals he desperately wanted to jam. And now, armed with undeniable proof from the most unexpected source, I saw everything with terrifying precision. I saw his deception, his cruelty, his profound underestimation of me. The moment shifted from pain to purpose. This wasn't about begging for his love or crying over the loss of the man he pretended to be. This was about survival. This was about justice. This was about ensuring he couldn't walk away from the wreckage he'd created without consequence. He thought I was too sensitive to handle the truth. He thought I would crumble. He expected tears. He expected hysterics. He expected wrong. I didn't confront him immediately. That wasn't my style. I needed to be strategic. I needed to turn the tables completely, use his own arrogance and the unexpected gift from his mistress against him. I spent the next few days in a strange, detached state. The pain was a dull thrumming beneath the surface, but on top, there was a steely focus. I researched. I made calls. I gathered every scrap of information, every screenshot, every timestamp. I organized it all meticulously. I thought about his plans, his assets, his professional reputation. I thought about how he saw me, fragile, emotional, easily dismissed. I would use that perception to my advantage. My strategy formed slowly, piece by piece. It wasn't about revenge in the heat of the moment. It was colder, more deliberate. It was about reclaiming my life and ensuring his actions had the maximum negative impact on him, not me. It wasn't enough for him to leave. He had to lose. And he had to lose in a way that blindsided him, a way that proved his assessment of me was catastrophically wrong. The sensitive wife was about to become his worst nightmare. The day I chose to confront him was a Tuesday. He came home, tired as usual, already starting the familiar routine of detachment. He poured himself a drink, loosened his tie, settling into the couch as if nothing in the world was amiss. I sat across from him, quiet. He barely looked at me. The air was thick with the usual silence, the one he mistook for peace. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, almost unnervingly calm. He sighed, already annoyed. "Can't this wait? I'm exhausted." "No," I said, my voice gaining a quiet strength that surprised even me. "It can't." He finally turned to face me, his expression one of weary impatience. "What is it now? Are you feeling sensitive about something again?" The faint sneer on his lips was like a match strike to the resolve I had built. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't scream the accusations burning on my tongue. Instead, I placed my phone on the coffee table between us, screen up. The first message from her, the one revealing everything, was visible. He glanced at it, then froze. His eyes widened, his face draining of color. He reached for it instinctively, then stopped, his hand hovering as if the screen might burn him. He looked at me, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock, then to a dawning, sickening dread. He knew. Instantly, he knew.
Where?
"Where did you get that?" His voice was a hoarse whisper, stripped of its arrogance. "It was sent to me," I replied, my voice still calm. by her. That's when his world imploded. Not because I knew about the affair. He likely anticipated that possibility eventually, but because she had been the one to tell me. The look on his face was pure, unadulterated shock. Betrayal meeting betrayal. The mistress, his partner in deception, had turned on him. He stammered, trying to concoct a lie, a denial, but the words caught in his throat. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate and trapped.
You
read my phone, he choked out, grasping at straws, trying to revert to the old script of my supposed boundary crossing. No, I said, picking up the phone, scrolling through the horrific evidence. She sent it to me. All of it. I showed him the messages from her to me, the cold, calculated delivery of his lies. His face contorted. This wasn't the confrontation he'd prepared for. He'd expected tears, accusations he could deflect, emotional arguments he could win by calling me sensitive. He hadn't expected this cold, hard proof delivered by his own accomplice. He hadn't expected my calm.
Why?
Why would she do that? He muttered, the question directed more at himself than me. The audacity, the sheer lack of concern for me, was breathtaking. His focus was solely on his own predicament, his own exposure. I don't know, I said, though I had my theories. Maybe she was tired of waiting for him to leave me. Maybe she realized he was lying to her too. Maybe she was just vindictive. It didn't matter. Her motive was irrelevant. The outcome was what mattered.
Does
anyone else know? He asked, panic rising in his voice. His reputation. His career. Those were his immediate concerns. That depends, I said, finally letting a sliver of the cold resolve show in my eyes. On what you do now. This was the climax. Not the affair itself, but the moment he realized he had been utterly outplayed, not by me initially, but by the combined force of his mistress's unexpected action and my calculated response. He had underestimated me so completely, blinded by his own narrative of my sensitivity. I laid out my terms, not with anger, but with quiet authority. I told him what I knew, not just about the affair, but about his financial maneuvers, the things he'd been subtly shifting, likely in preparation to leave me with less. The mistress's messages had contained enough breadcrumbs to allow me to connect some dots he thought were hidden. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, watching his eyes widen further. I have copies of everything she sent me. And I have leverage you didn't account for. I didn't need to elaborate on the leverage. His face showed he understood. He'd built a life on lies, and now those lies were collapsing, exposed not just to me, but with the potential to be exposed to his work, his friends, his family. His carefully constructed world was teetering. He started to argue, to bluster, to try and regain control. He even, unbelievably, tried to turn it back on me. You're still doing this, making a huge deal out of this. You're being so dramatic, so sensitive. And that's when it happened. The scream. It wasn't me. It was him. I stood up, calm, collected. I'm not being sensitive, I said, my voice low and clear, delivering the final blow. I'm being smart. Something you clearly weren't counting on. I listed, succinctly, precisely, what I had already done. Consulted legal counsel, secured certain assets, informed specific individuals who had a vested interest in his professional integrity. Each item was a nail in the coffin of his carefully guarded image. He had thought I was too emotional, too sensitive to even gather proof, let alone act on it. He was so wrong. The fact that his mistress had handed me the initial proof was the ultimate irony, a spectacular self-inflicted wound he'd never anticipated. He had dismissed me as a threat, focused only on hiding his tracks from the outside world, never imagining the person he lived with would be the one to dismantle him, armed with information from the other woman. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and panic. He screamed then, truly screamed, a guttural roar of disbelief and rage as he saw his life, his reputation, everything he valued, slipping through his fingers. He hadn't expected a fight. He'd expected a surrender. He had expected tears. I gave him terms. He had expected me to break, I stood taller than I ever had. The aftermath was messy, as breakups often are, but it was on my terms. The divorce was swift, fueled by the undeniable evidence and his desperate need to prevent further exposure. He lost a lot more than he ever intended to. His plans to leave me financially vulnerable crumbled under the weight of his own deceit and the leverage I held, thanks to his mistress's unexpected delivery service and my own strategic actions. There was no grand, satisfying confrontation with her. I never spoke to her again. I didn't need to. She had been a twisted catalyst, an unwitting tool in my emancipation. The silence after he was gone was immense. The comfortable house felt empty, but it was mine. The path ahead was no longer smooth and predictable. It was uncertain, winding, but it was a path I chose. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when the betrayal, the gaslighting, the sheer cruelty of his dismissiveness would wash over me, leaving me breathless with pain and anger. But the sensitive label, the one he'd used to belittle me, became a strange sort of badge of honor. My sensitivity hadn't been a weakness. It had been my awareness. My ability to feel deeply had made the pain acute, yes, but it had also allowed me to connect with my own instincts, to see the subtle shifts, to understand the emotional landscape he was manipulating. He had tried to weaponize my nature, and in the end, that same nature, combined with cold logic and a stroke of twisted luck, had been my shield and my sword. I learned that being sensitive doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're open, you're observant, you feel the tremors others might miss. The trick is not to let others use that openness against you. The trick is to trust your own radar, even when someone you love tells you it's broken. My life now isn't the one I planned on that smooth, predictable path. It's richer, perhaps, scarred but stronger. I built myself back, piece by piece. The garden still needs attention, but now I have the time, and I plant things that bloom, things that symbolize resilience. I learned that sometimes the most profound strength comes from the places where you were told you were weakest. And sometimes the person who tried to break you is the one who, inadvertently, shows you how to become unbreakable. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.